Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. On this episode, Marshall Kosloff talks with Charles Edel about U.S. relations with Australia and the broader Indo-Pacific region.
Charles Edel, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma.
Thanks, Marshall. Really excited to be back on the show.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. We actually first spoke back last summer during the Clements Center's history seminar. You gave a great talk on AUKUS, Australia, and the broader Indo-Pacific region. Events have interceded over the past few months, though, that not only require us to update the talk you gave, but also provide a lot of interesting context. So you recently went to Australia after the election. Can we just start by discussing the mood in country as folks react to 2025?
Absolutely. So I just got back from a whirlwind tour of New Zealand and Australia, where I was down there to kind of talk about, what things look like after our election, kind of assess the mood down there. And I think, to answer the question, people are watching with great intent what is developing out of Washington. And, I took off on a Thursday, and thank goodness I had Wi-Fi on the plane because things were changing almost by the hour as President-elect Trump continued to name new nominees to the cabinet, some of whom are very well known to Australia and New Zealand, others of whom, I think all of us spend a fair amount of time Googling, not only who they were, but what their views are on foreign policy. So in general, the mood, certainly from Canberra and elsewhere, is watchful. Some trepidation, I think, because, this is a transition and this is a bigger transition than most. And some concern about where some of the larger equities of the relationship might go. But I think not a sky is falling. Let's work this one issue at a time type of approach.
What would be the obvious areas of concern from Canberra's perspective?
Well, look, the number one issue, which isn't an actual issue, so therefore I don't know how helpful this is, but is questions about how deeply committed the United States is to remaining deeply anchored in the Indo-Pacific region. As Canberra knows, as Wellington knows, as Seoul and Tokyo know, of course, too, without the United States, there is no balance in the region. You can have a rough balance of power with the United States. Hopefully, you can have a favorable balance of power, as the Foreign Minister Penny Wong continues to discuss. But if you subtract the United States from the equation, there is no balance. And then the region looks very, very different, greenlighting in many effects a Chinese sphere of influence. So the number one, in fact, overriding in many ways existential question is, how committed will the United States remain to being in the region and being a committed partner to those in the region? So that's kind of the superseding question before we get to actual policies. I think some of the questions around policies, Marshall, are first and foremost for Australia about kind of wither AUKUS under Donald Trump. There are other questions about U.S. force posture initiatives, which are much larger and broader than AUKUS itself. There are a number of other questions. Obviously, climate change efforts, resilience efforts are going to take a much lower priority under the Trump administration. But there are also questions about tariffs, how they will affect not only Australia, but in kind of a secondary effect, what they will mean for the Australian economy. And then other questions, too, like whether or not the United States will work with Australia on efforts that it's begun to pursue, such as critical collaboration on critical minerals and the clean energy transition. So you asked me what are top of mind. There are a lot of things that are top of mind right now, but I think they start from that, broad question of what does the United States partnership look like with a very different administration as it comes into power in Washington?
And as you pointed out, you weren't just traveling to Australia, but you also were in New Zealand. From the American perspective, obviously, the geography makes it so they'd be logical to combine those two into one. But obviously, these are different governments in different countries. To what degree are Australia and New Zealand on the same page when it comes to these issues?
Look, Marshall, them is fighting words, right? From a Kiwi perspective or from an Australian perspective, these are very different places. In fact, New Zealand had been a treaty ally of the United States until the 1980s, along with Australia. That's the kind of the origin of the ANZUS treaty. But because of issues around nuclear related issues, the Kiwis actually withdrew from the alliance in the 1980s. That doesn't mean that they withdrew from being partners with the U.S., but there's not a formal alliance as there is with the Australians. Frankly, what's been happening in New Zealand is really interesting. over the last, say, 5 to 10 years. And even with their newest government, which came into power about a year ago, because of similar set of stimuli, otherwise known as China becoming more assertive around the region, New Zealand foreign policy has begun to develop in ways that look more aligned, although obviously not allied with the United States. New Zealand is an ally of the Australians, and interestingly, the two of them have taken steps recently to formalize some of the planning that they have around that alliance. They had the first ever kind of 2+2 foreign minister and defense ministers meetings between the Kiwis and the Aussies earlier this year. So look, when you go to Wellington, the capital of New Zealand, and when you go to Canberra, the capital of Australia, you'll actually hear a very different origin story about how they think about their place in the world and what security means for the two of them. I'm generalizing here, but in Australia, you tend to hear an origin story that relates to World War II, that relates to the Japanese advance towards the Australian mainland, that revolves around the Battle of the Coral Sea, where the Japanese were pushed back for the first time, and there was going to be no invasion of Australia. And I make that point historically, Marshall, not only because you're affiliated with the Clements Center, but because the origin story in many ways of Australian foreign policy that the Australians tell themselves is that is an existential moment for them. If they are cut off from an allied state and left to fend for themselves on their own without allies, without connection, that creates existential problems for the Australians. So primarily when they think about the region, they think about making sure that they are not cut off and that they have great and powerful friends. That is a phrase from Australian political history that around about that moment, they realized that the British were no longer able to guarantee their security. So thereafter, they would look to the United States as the great and powerful friend to help provide their security. So it is primarily a story that revolves around hard physical defense security. If you kind of move across the ditch, across the Tasman Sea, it's a different story that they tell in New Zealand. New Zealand is a small state, only 5 million people, about a fifth the size population-wise of Australia. And a story that you'll hear pretty regularly is in the 1970s when the Kiwis lost their market access to the British market and the European market, really, as the Brits oriented themselves towards the EU. And that sent their economy into a tailspin because a small island nation that is anchored to its sea lines and is a trading nation fundamentally needs economic security. So when they think about security, it starts with the economic dimension. Who are their trading partners? Are they diversified? Do they make sure that they are not able to be cut off, not only physically, but from economic lifeline ties? So you asked about the difference between the two. The conversation oftentimes starts, but doesn't stop in the security realm for the Aussies, whereas the conversation is about economic ties, more so for the Kiwis. Now, with that kind of big scope, I'd say that obviously the New Zealanders think a lot about their physical security and about those of their neighbors in the Pacific Island states. For Australia, they think about their economy too, because they are the most dependent, advanced economy in the world on trade with China. Right before the pandemic, as much as 40% of their trade went to China. So these are intermingled kind of perspectives of how they look at the world, but the set of kind of driving issues are a little bit different depending on where you sit.
So the next question would be, I'd love for you to just give a quick overview or more than quick, because this is going to be a complicated topic, obviously. I'd love for you to discuss just the general reality of AUKUS over the past 4 years and how that then is going to shape how we're looking at a second Trump administration. Obviously, this was one of the concerns that you listed Australians were considering.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. But, as you were asking a question, Marshall, I realized that on the last question about differences between New Zealand and Australia, I left out one key component, which is, I think, a real driving similarity. And I just want to make sure that we tee that up before we move on to AUKUS, which is the change in kind of thinking about security that happened in Australia is not dissimilar to the change that is happening currently in New Zealand, which is it's prompted, I'd say largely, not by what necessarily is happening inside of China, that they're becoming more repressive, not even necessarily that it's motivated by what China is doing externally, becoming more assertive, but rather it was occasioned by what China was doing inside of Australia. That is the political interference that it became increasingly clear was happening inside the Australian polity. That is a similar conversation that is now springing to life inside of New Zealand. They just released their second annual intelligence threat assessment, where they assessed as the number one threat to New Zealand sovereignty is political interference. They are somewhat agnostic about which countries, but regularly the cases that they point to and the unofficial conversations are Chinese interference within inside of New Zealand. So I know you had asked about AUKUS, but I think when we talk about kind of similarities of approaches that are motivating folks in the Antipodes, that's a big one. But I am now happy to kind of hop around to your question about AUKUS, Marshall.
Before you go in, since this was the whole subject of an entire talk you gave this past summer, when I say give a quick answer, feel free to expound as wide as possible. What's the too long, didn't quite listen version of the story that listeners need to be considering?
Yeah, I think your question is kind of what's the current state of the conversation on AUKUS. But for those of your listeners who aren't totally wrapped into the details of AUKUS, I've written on this multiple times, but so have many others. There's a rip-roaring debate over AUKUS, which is, of course, the somewhat awkward acronym of Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States partnership to provide Pillar 1, nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines to the Australians to make sure that they can acquire them, maintain them, and then eventually build them themselves. And Pillar 2, set up a consortium, a defense consortium between those three countries, maybe more as well, that helps pool research efforts, capital, know-how to provide advanced and emerging technologies that can be used by these countries to create deterrent effects. So that's what AUKUS is. In terms of the current debate, and I had said earlier, some of the anxieties, I think, that are resident in Australia about this are, as this legislation has moved forward, as this initiative has kind of plowed forward, one of the things is that this is going to take a long time. This is not something that will happen overnight. In fact, it's a multi-decadal effort that will mean that administrations of every political party have to support this because there'll be transfers of power in these democratic states, number one. Number two, some of the legislation that we saw pass in the United States last year said that the president of the United States has to certify that before the transfer of any submarines from the United States to Australia, and by transfer I mean sale, that the United States has enough submarines itself to meet its own requirements, which are set by the Congress. So the concerns are that the United States does not have enough submarines right now, that is correct. The United States does not have enough submarines based on what it sets as its own requirements, and therefore that the United States will ultimately not be able to meet this deal and will walk away from this, leaving Australia high and dry without any submarines of any kind. That's the concern right now. And in some ways, even if you kind of have seen many statements of assurance we're pretty sure that this is all signs point to go from the Trump administration, the truth of the matter is, at this point, Marshall, we actually don't know because, number one, the United States does not produce enough submarines right now. And number two, Donald Trump literally has not said anything ever about AUKUS. Now, this is a type of deal that you could see Donald Trump wanting to get behind. It puts money into the United States from the Australians. It helps our most trusted allies become more capable. Many in those around Donald Trump in the national security circles, including his Secretary of State nominee, Marco Rubio, including J.D. Vance, including Michael Waltz, the national security advisor, have all said positive things about AUKUS, but Donald Trump himself hasn't said anything, therefore, I think, heightening some of the concerns.
I'd like to zoom out for a second and just note that we're obviously having this conversation in the context of America's policy towards the Indo-Pacific. And I'd like you just to sort of talk about the Indo-Pacific region in general, the degree to which there is a shared conception of the region between the United States and its allies, the context that China is bringing to the region, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because I'd like to actually talk about the meta here.
Sure. Look, the meta is a pretty meta question, so we could take this any number of ways. But I think, the first place to begin thinking about this is the terminology and therefore the geography of what we're talking about is something that's evolved over time. It used to be what America simply referred to as Asia. Then it became the Asia-Pacific region. When I was at the State Department, we referred to it as the Asia-Pacific region. And it's become commonly referred to as the Indo-Pacific region. Now, the origin of that broadened geographical scope comes about for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is not a U.S. insight. This is something that the Japanese actually put forth first under Shinzo Abe. It's something that a bunch of Australian scholars really amplified as being a useful construct. Makes sense for Australia if you think about their geography. They sit on both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. But strategically, kind of above and beyond the geography, the point is when we begin to think about what might lend itself towards a balancing effort of China, and you think about which countries are concerned about China's rise, but also have the potential to have enormous throw weight militarily, economically, technologically, it's hard to think of that kind of balance of power, that concert of powers, without India in the mix. So the point really is to bring India and the Indian Ocean region into the game as well. And so it's a geographical construct that's been stretched to have strategic effects. But I think your question, Marshall, also points to the fact that because different players sit in different geographic positions, they therefore have somewhat different views about the strategy and the strategic priorities, really, of the region. And we don't have the time or place to go into kind of how Tokyo thinks about this, how Seoul thinks about this, how Beijing thinks about this, or how Delhi thinks about this. But suffice it to say that the four main countries that are working together here that have very like-minded views that form the Quad, all, I think we can say, are sufficiently alarmed by the increasingly assertive way that China has behaved in the region that's motivating them to work more closely together. And the other thing that's interesting is even those countries that are not as like-minded, not as well synced, say, as those four, but other countries in the region, be they New Zealand, be they South Korea, be they some of the Southeast Asian nations, have all over the past couple of years began using this construct themselves, talking about the Indo-Pacific region, releasing strategic documents and even strategies about the Indo-Pacific that lay out how they think about this, what their priorities are as well. So again, I think the important thing to take away from this is that it is a geography, but it's a geographical construct that's meant to have strategic effects.
And how should we think broadly about China in the region?
Well, there are a lot of different ways to think about China in the region. China is a growing power and has been for decades at this point. It's a country that is deeply embedded into the economic architecture of the region. China is also a country that has undertaken the largest kind of military modernization and kind of growth that we've seen maybe in the history of the world, but certainly since World War II. And that in and of itself is not necessarily alarming. It's the ways in which China has increasingly decided to put those increased capabilities to use. And it is increasingly to lean on their neighbors, to assert their interests, and in ways that seemed increasingly hostile, assertive, and intended to kind of push other nations to think about the region in Chinese ways. It hasn't always produced that effect, but I think the number one way that you can think about this, at least strategically, Marshall, is that China has been the United States' number one ally in the region. I say that somewhat flippantly, but by that I simply mean the fact that China has continued to provide a rationale because of the way that it has behaved for other countries to want the United States to remain firmly anchored in the region to provide balance to it.
So for the last big question here, when it comes to the intersection of U.S. foreign policy and election season, I'm most fascinated by categories where there either was a bipartisan consensus that fell apart or there is a new bipartisan consensus. So it should be noted that a real through line between President Trump's first term and then Biden's term was just a buying of the idea that the post-90s China consensus wasn't working. Now, that took itself in different directions when it came to actual implementation, but there was a shared critique that was accepted. So when it comes to Australia, the Indo-Pacific, these different regions, to what degree are you confident that there is some type of shared model, critique, assessment that may look different when it comes to how a Democratic administration versus a Republican administration would implement things. But to what degree is there a bipartisan consensus on the region?
You mean to what degree is there bipartisan consensus in Australia and New Zealand and other places, or in Washington?
In the United States towards the region in general?
I think one of the things that we tend to say out here in kind of Washington land is that if we're looking for one area of consensus, broad bipartisan consensus, it's on the Indo-Pacific, about kind of the role and the importance of allies and partners, and on the Indo-Pacific in terms of what a challenge China presents, not only in the defense realm, but across almost every field of endeavor, technologically, economically, politically. I do think that point broadly holds here in Washington. And it's one that's developed over years. It started building towards the end of the Obama administration. And then under President Trump's first term of office, I think his administration can really be credited with taking a more assertive set of policies that took this debate about China away from simply the national security domain and put it in a much broader context in terms of what the relationship with China was doing economically, in terms of manufacturing here in the United States, what it had meant to have China sign up to international trade agreements and then not play by the rules that it had signed up to be. So it is now, as you know, as I hear every time I'm in Texas too, this is a conversation that supersedes kind of the military and defense sphere and kind of is much broader about that. I think that is a point of consensus, although, of course, there are debates about on the margins. The hot debate at this point in Washington, takes a number of different angles. So the first, there's one debate recurrently about what are we trying to achieve vis-a-vis China? Are we looking to just manage competition, which is what the Biden administration had put forward, or are we trying to win the competition with China, which is what some of those associated with President Trump, both in his first term and then now kind of gathering around him, have said. That's kind of one debate. Another debate is what's the best angle of approach and how pointy the United States wants to be. Is it going to be primarily prosecuted on economic terms and with tariffs, as President Trump wants to do? Or is this a kind of technological competition first and foremost, which seems to be in many ways where the Biden administration was? And then a third, I think, debate right now, and that we're watching play out, that I hear about when I travel around the region too, Marshall, is what's the best way to gather a large coalition together to prosecute the competition? Is it by leaning heavily on and pressurizing U.S. allies to do more on their own? Or is it about kind of throwing America's arms around its allies and encouraging them to do more alongside of the United States? That's kind of a false characterization to a certain degree about the nature of the debate. But I also think those are kind of different impulses that are informing the debate about the best angle of approach for strategic competition. I will say that in Washington, there are voices too that do not think that strategic competition is the right frame of reference, but they are really outliers in debate contemporaneously about what the preferred approach is. The debate right now is, how does the United States gain advantage? What are the objectives that it's trying to achieve? And how does it gather as many allies and partners alongside of it as possible?
That is an excellent summary and an excellent place to end. Charles, thank you so much for joining me on Horns of a Dilemma.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.